Hey everybody, it's Hovis here, and today I'm going to tell you about a terrible story of a poor couple in Riverside, California, who had their house stolen by a squatter. And actually, it gets a little worse. This was the person who owned the property before, sold it to them, refused to leave, and now won't get out, and they've been paying the mortgage for over a year. This is an absolute scumbag of a human being who knew exactly what he was doing. But let me tell you the story first. Back in January of 2020, this couple, Tracy and Miles Albert in Riverside, California, bought a nice house for $560,000. They needed to close very quickly. And so what they did was they put all their life savings together, their money together, coupled that with a hard money loan, bought this property very quickly. And what happened after the closing date, the person who sold them the house just never moved out. They stuck around, decided that, yeah, I sold the house. Yeah, I got all the money from the house. It was a property that was free and clear. So when this guy sold them the house, he got all of that money, that $560,000 in cash in his pocket, and just decided not to move out. While this couple is trying to figure out what the heck is going on, how to get this person out, all of a sudden California instituted a COVID eviction moratorium, meaning they're not even going to be hearing cases about eviction until this whole pandemic thing goes away. And so this person who sold this house is today still living in that property. We're talking about over a year. This guy has been staying in this property without paying any rent, and this couple who bought the property had been paying their loan every single month with the anticipation of eventually, maybe one day, hopefully, moving into this thing. Back in 2010, 11, 12, when I was doing a lot of foreclosures, this was not an uncommon thing where someone would lose the house, stay in the property, and just never move. That's what got me more familiar with what's called squatter laws. Believe it or not, there are laws on the books that if someone has been occupying a house, whether they own it or not, whether they have a lease with someone or not, they have rights to live and continue to live in that property. And depending on the county that you're dealing with, it could be pretty egregious. Each county and each municipality have its own set of laws related to squatters. You may have to do what's called a judicial eviction rather than the typical evictions. The typical eviction goes something like this. Tenant is late on their rent payment. We post a notice. They ignore us. We then file with the court. It takes time and time to process. There's warnings and warnings. Eventually, they'll show up in court. And when you show up in court, it's eviction court. There's a long line of people. It's kind of like an assembly line. People wait their turn. They get up in front of the judge, says what's going on. The judge makes a decision, and 9 times out of 10, the person gets evicted. Rarely does someone actually not get evicted if it's already gone to court. Typically, that court case is going to take 5, 10, 15 minutes tops. It's a very fast process in most courts across the country. However, when you are dealing with squatter laws, it's not a typical situation. See, there is no lease with a squatter. It's just a human being living in a house. And so what you have to do now is a judicial eviction, meaning you have to file a lawsuit, wait for them to counter, talk about discovery, and it's more like a traditional lawsuit, and therefore much, much more expensive. The expensive part in that entire thing is hiring your attorney, talking $10, $15, $20, even $30,000 to go through the whole process. What has screwed this entire thing up is the eviction moratorium. So because of the eviction moratorium, in some states and some counties, they're not even listening to eviction requests. Now, we've been able to process evictions. I did a video on the eviction moratorium. You might want to check that out. I'll put a link in the description below. Now, let me explain to you what I think is really happening. On the surface, what it looks like is because of COVID, this guy is taking advantage of the eviction moratorium, therefore staying in the house long term more than he should have. What I think is really happening, this guy is just a Class A scumbag. He sold the house in January of 2020. The eviction moratorium didn't go in effect until March. So several months before the eviction moratorium, this scumbag knew exactly what he was going to do. He was going to sell this house. He was going to get all of that money because he owned it free and clear. And then he was going to rest on the good nature, liberal mindset of the local municipality to not kick him out of his house. And he got lucky. And how he got lucky was in that eviction moratorium came in March. And all the courts shut down, and he's been living high on the hog this entire time. This guy knew exactly what he was doing. And there are scumbags out there all the time trying to take advantage of people in situations just like this. Think about this couple. They've bought their dream home. They're expecting to move in. This guy's like, nah, I'm gonna take advantage of the laws. And I just hit the lottery because now I can live in a place without making any payments whatsoever. Frankly, the chances that he on the way out is gonna damage the house are pretty high. That's what we saw back in 2010 and 11 when we were dealing with a lot of foreclosures. So the question is, what to do about all this? How can you avoid these kind of squatter laws? Well, it's really simple. Number one, when you buy a house, make sure that it's vacant. I know that that seems obvious, but if you make sure that that property is vacant, you're not having to deal with any squatters. So we've bought a lot of houses where there have been occupants inside, typically tenants, but sometimes owner occupants. When it's a tenant, it's really simple. As long as we have the lease, we know the terms of what's going on. Most of the time we're buying properties that are month to month, and therefore we can get them out very quickly if we need to, or we renegotiate a lease once we've purchased the property and say, hey, would you like to keep living here? That's a great scenario for us if they're a good paying tenant. Typically they're not a good paying tenant, because if they were a good paying tenant, I wouldn't be able to get the discount and the deal that I got. Now, when I buy the property, I'm taking over the spot of the owner, the previous owner, the person who sold the house to me. I want to make sure that I have the terms of the lease, the contract between the previous owner and the tenant, and if there's any kind of issue, I can take that to a judge and say, I need justice. Now, when you're dealing with an owner-occupant, it's a different story. See, you need to be way more leery of owner-occupants, people who live in that property, not moving out before you buy it because of this exact situation. Frankly, if you Google squatter laws, you will see stories like this all the time. It's a scumbaggery practice that some people get turned on to, and because they have no morals, decide to take advantage of people in a situation like this. Use the law for their own benefit. That's terrible. The moral compass of those human beings are horrendous. But if you are buying a house that is occupied by the one selling it to you, the day of closing, make sure that they're out. Go visit the property. Go walk it around. Go see that this person has moved out of the property. And when you close, get the keys. See, if you can't get both of those things at closing, don't close. File a memorandum against that property, cloud the title so that nobody else can come in behind you and screw up your deal. But don't close that deal. Don't buy that property. You could be dealing with a professional squatter who is going to, for a very small fee to his attorney, make it so that you are the one paying for him to live there. But you can avoid that situation by just buying a property that's vacant. So that's number one. Number two is get or review a lease. Like I said before, when I'm buying a property that's occupied, I want to make sure that I have a lease. What has this person living in this property agreed to with the previous owner? I want that lease. If you're buying a property with an owner-occupant and they are planning on staying over, which happens. I've bought houses with owners planning on staying in the house for a couple of months or a couple of weeks after we close the deal. Wonderful. I want a lease. Make sure that that lease is very attractive for you, the buyer. Make sure that the rents are as high as you can make them. That's part of the negotiation. But what you want to make sure is that you have something in writing talking about their occupancy after you've closed on the property. That's what a lease will help you do. It'll help you get some relief from a judge. That contract now says, this is what we agreed to. If you don't have that, now they're a squatter, and now you're dealing with squatter laws, which are written by these benevolent lawmakers who don't want to kick poor people out of their house, and they feel so terrible. And the reality is, these squatters are people who are taking advantage of the law. That's who they are. So number one, make sure you don't close until the property is vacant. Number two, if you know that the property is going to be occupied, make sure you get or review a lease. Now, number three, in that lease, make sure you have an aggressive holdover fee. something like $500 a day. If this person occupies the property longer than you agreed to, they need to pay you $500 per day until they vacate that property. All of a sudden, someone starting to look at a $15,000 monthly rent might consider getting their stuff out of there and vacating the property. Now, additionally, what you make sure you do is get the seller's personal information, their social security number, their date of birth, their driver's license number, just like a tenant. Make them fill out an application for you. If they don't do what they said they're gonna do according to that lease, now you have some legal ramifications to go after them for collection, judgment, garnishing their wages. All of those kind of things make it so that someone thinks twice about doing the whole squatter program. If someone is unwilling to go through these very simple motions, hey, Mr. Seller, we can agree that you can stay here. I just need to make sure that we have an agreement in writing. I need to make sure that if you don't do what we're saying in writing, that there are some steep penalties for this, and I need to be able to collect on those steep penalties. If you can't agree to that, Mr. Seller, I'm afraid that you're just gonna try to sell this house to me and squat. Now that's not what you're looking to do, is it? No. Okay, then sign the doggone paperwork. That's how it works. Number 4, be unreasonable with unreasonable people. Some of you are gonna say, Brad, what do you mean? I learned a long time ago, you can't be reasonable with unreasonable people. Your reason will hinder you in dealing with those unreasonable people. See, an unreasonable person looks at reason as weakness. And so I developed this strategy that I call the intensified mirror. See, I'm an intensified mirror. If you're good to me, I will be better to you. But if you're bad to me, I'll be worse to you. And what do I mean in a scenario like this? If a squatter wants to play the legal game and say, I've got squatter rights, then I want to play the legal game as well, because I have landlord rights, I have property owner rights. I have rights to access the property with reasonable notice, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because it's my property. Those are property owner rights. If it were me, I'd be giving reasonable notice for all the maintenance that needs to be happening in this property. I've got to make sure that the batteries are nice and charged in every single smoke detector. Of course, I'm going to only inspect one at a time. I'm going to also make sure that the furnace filter is changed. And so accessing the property over and over again. The only thing you need to make sure when you're accessing a property is that you give them reasonable notice. What is reasonable notice? It's going to be defined in your local municipality. I would look that up. Maybe I can be such an irritant legally and such an annoying person to this squatter that they just say, I can't deal with this anymore, I'm leaving. Why wouldn't you at least make it more difficult for them to live there? See, you have the rights to access your own property. You own the property. Does that mean that they're not going to call the police? Yes, they probably will call the police. If you show up to the property to do some maintenance and they're like, no, call the police will show up. You know what the police will say? This is a civil matter. Now they'll stand there and they'll make sure that nobody is going to do anything criminal. But you have the rights to access your own property. So have the police there, absolutely, while you are slowly changing the batteries in all the fire detectors, slowly changing the furnace filter, inspecting every doorknob. Now, what I am saying to you is don't break the law. Make sure you understand the law. This person is taking advantage of you. And it's very hard for kind-hearted people, reasonable people, to deal with unreasonable scumbags. That's why you have to activate your unreasonable side. They don't understand reason. I'm in a Facebook group where this article got put up there and they talked about cash for keys. These people have offered this person cash for keys, $560,000 in cash for the keys of the property, which they should have got when they closed, but they didn't. They assumed that these people wanted to sell this property, that they were going to give them the money that they were looking for, that they would close at the title company, that person would get that money and move out and go on to the next thing. And it didn't happen. And the question is, now what? Unfortunately, there's not much. It's sad. It's really sad. And the hope is that this poor couple can keep this house. The hope is that they don't go bankrupt in this scenario. The hope is that this poor couple gets the justice that they deserve. And unfortunately, sometimes you've got to take some of that justice into your own hands. Do so legally, under the protection of law enforcement, making sure that you don't break any laws in the process. Understand what your legal rights are. I hope after watching this video, you now realize that buying a vacant house is the best thing to do. And if not, make sure you got what the agreement is in writing with some aggressive penalties for not following the written agreement. Thanks for watching this video. Hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.